Evening. My name is Christoph Straub and I'm the Senior Manager of Adult Learning here at TIFF. It's my huge pleasure to welcome you to the second event in this year's Books on Film series, Whit Stillman on Love and Friendship. Yes. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge where tonight's event is taking place. We're on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community and to show the work of Indigenous filmmakers here at TIFF. This spring, we have the pleasure of screening Guy Edenshaw and Helen Hake Brown's Skaawe Kuna, Edge of the Knife, here in the building. It is a Canada's Top 10 selection and the first feature film in the Haida language, and is as such part of the effort to revitalize a language and culture that have been threatened by colonialism and the residential school system here in Canada. We're proud to be able to screen this film and encourage you to seek out and support creative endeavors by Indigenous artists and filmmakers year-round. Yeah, thank you. And now, on behalf of TIFF, I'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, and our major public supporters, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. We'd also like to thank Warby Parker, our presenting partner for the series, Penguin Random House Canada, our programming partner, and Star Metro, our media partner. Last but not least, a thank you to donors and members like you for supporting TIFF's charitable mission to transform the way we see the world through film. Last, thank you for joining us for our celebration of Jane Austen at TIFF by Lightbox. Prior to tonight's event, we were delighted to have Whit Stillman join us in the atrium for tea, scones, and a book signing of his novelization of Love and Friendship, and some strictly Austen ballroom dancing, courtesy of performers from the Jane Austen re-enactment community, Danceweavers. Yes, they're actually here. Please join me. A big welcome and thank you to them for helping kick off the night's entertainment. Whit also returns tomorrow for a Q&A following a TIFF Cinematheque special screening of The Last Day of Disco, his affectionate and witty look at the early 1980s Manhattan nightclub scene. The 35mm print for tomorrow's screening comes from TIFF's own film reference library screening collection and is not to be missed. And before I hand over to our Books on Film host, Eleanor Wachtel, just a reminder of two of our upcoming events in this series. On April 15th, renowned author and scholar Imani Perry joins us for a screening of A Raisin in the Sun and discusses the ongoing significance and relevance of Lorraine Hansberry's most influential play, which is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year, and the lauded film adaptation, which stars Sidney Poitier, of course. And on May 6th, screenwriter and producer Robin Swycourt looks back at her 1994 adaptation of Louisa May Alcott's classic Little Women, starring Winona Ryder, Kirsten Dunst, Claire Danes, and Christian Bale. Swycourt, who received an Academy Award nomination for her work on The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, is also a producer on the highly anticipated new version of Little Women directed by Greta Gerwig. Single tickets are still available for these events, and if you are a subscriber and would like to change your seats to sit with your friends for individual events, our box office team can help you find seats so that you can sit together. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our founding host for Books on Film, Eleanor Wachtel.
Thank you all, and thank you for coming tonight. I was going to mention the two other events as part of the series. June 3rd, we have the award-winning poet, novelist, and film enthusiast Michael Ondaatje talking about one of his favorite movies, John Boorman's neo-noir 1967 thriller Point Blank. And then to wrap up the season on June 24th, English novelist Rachel Seifert, who writes powerful fiction that explores moral responsibility, courage, and fear, especially at times of great upheaval. And her compelling novella and the 2012 movie, Laura, draws on her own family's legacy of Nazism. So that's in June. But now on to this evening's entertainment with Whit Stillman, the screenwriter and director of Jane Austen's relatively little-known novella, Lady Susan. How can that be, you may ask, given that Austen's 6 major novels have been famously adapted so many times for cinema and television, not to mention reimagined sequels and prequels. But Lady Susan sort of fell between the cracks of her juvenilia and subsequent publications. To put it briefly in context, Jane Austen was born in December in 1775 in the remote Hampshire village of Steventon. She had 5 older brothers, 1 older sister, and then a younger brother. Her parents were what were described as part of the lesser gentry. Her father was the rector, who also took in students. Her mother, of a slightly higher class, wrote as well. They were well educated. There were a lot of books around. Her brothers rose to high positions in the Navy, in banking, the clergy, and so on. 2 of them worked at a humorous weekly, The Loiterer, at Oxford. And at 12 or 13, mostly educated at home, Jane was contributing satirical pieces and writing to entertain at family theatricals. In her teens, she wrote subversively about a variety of genres, stories of sexual innuendo, violence, adultery, abandoned babies, often featuring cruel and neglectful parents, very unlike her own. As Carol Shields points out in her brief biography, Jane Austen chose to focus her writing on daughters rather than mothers, with the one exception, as she points out, of her short and curious novel, Lady Susan. It revolves around a beautiful, impoverished, sexually active widow in her mid-30s. Austen wrote it as a series of letters she read widely, including the epistolary novels characteristic of the 18th century, such as those by Samuel Richardson, Fanny Burney, and likely de la Close Les Liaisons Dangereuses. Just to give you a picture, if I can quote again from Carol Shields, Jane Austen's writing output slowed down somewhat in her late teens, but then all at once, when she was about 20, she completed a short novel, Lady Susan. Her father had given her a portable writing desk for her 19th birthday, a pretty thing of mahogany and leather, equipped with a glass inkstand and a drawer. The gift may have represented a kind of permission on her parents' part, exactly what all young writers need if they are to continue in their pursuit. Lady Susan was the first piece she wrote at her new desk. Her brothers during this period were engaged in combat at sea, while she, at home in Steventon, pen in hand, brought to the page the only kind of combat a woman was allowed: the conquest of hearts and the overturning of domestic arrangements. This was around 1795. Austen soon turned her attention to Eleanor and Marianne, also written in letter form, a first draft of what became Sense and Sensibility, when it was published in 1811. Lady Susan, the title was chosen by Austen's nephew, only came out in 1871 as an appendix to his memoir To His Aunt, long after her death in 1817 at the age of 41. But its relative obscurity meant that Whit Stillman could make the first, the one and only adaptation of this work. He not only renamed it Love and Friendship from an earlier piece of Austen juvenilia, he also wrote his own book, a companion, not a novelization, called Love and Friendship, in which Jane Austen's Lady Susan Vernon is entirely vindicated. We'll talk more about that later. I've been a fan of Whit Stillman for a long time, going right back to 1990 and his first film, Metropolitan, which marked the start of a triptych about American 20-somethings at home and abroad that he's referred to as his Doomed Bourgeois in Love series. Or as a character in Metropolitan puts it, UB, or UHB, Urban Haute Bourgeoisie, during the debutante season in Manhattan. Stillman is an auteur. He writes and directs his films. He often produces as well. He was nominated for an Oscar for his screenplay for Metropolitan. He got a production deal with Castle Rock Pictures to make his next 2 movies, Barcelona and The Last Days of Disco. The latter stars 2 of tonight's actresses, Kate Beckinsale and Chloe Sevigny. In fact, Beckinsale, British herself, has talked about how perfect Whit Stillman is to adapt Jane Austen in his latest film, Love and Friendship. Not only are there various allusions to Jane Austen in his earlier movies, but, she said, there's the fact that the aristocratic lineage back to the Mayflower, New England, Ivy League Stillman is perhaps more like Britons than most Americans are. I won't try to unpack all of that, but just to say that Whit Stillman was born in 1952 in Washington, D.C., and raised in Cornwall-on-Hudson in upstate New York. His great-grandfather was president of a banking leviathan that would become Citibank. Watch for Lady Susan's toss-off about bankers and wealth in Love and Friendship. Whit's father ran for state senator and then served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce under JFK. Whit studied history at Harvard and wrote for the Crimson, shades here of damsels in distress. He subsequently worked in publishing at a Manhattan news service as a sales agent for Spanish filmmakers and running an illustration agency in New York. Meanwhile, in the mid-1980s, while he was writing the screenplay for Metropolitan, he was reading Pride and Prejudice as a palate cleanser, as he put it. He has two of the characters in the film argue about Mansfield Park. Well, maybe argue isn't exactly right, because the guy admits that he's never read Jane Austen. He doesn't read novels. He prefers good literary criticism. As he says, that way you get both the novelist's ideas and the critic's thinking. In case you forgot, a couple of other things that Whit Stillman and Jane Austen have in common is that they are very funny, and there is always dancing in their work. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Whit Stillman.
Thank you very much. I'm going to change our topic for now.
Fine.
I'm going to beg to differ with the legend of the 18, 19, 20-year-old writing the manuscript that was later titled Lady Susan. Because
She wrote it.
What?
Because she did a fair copy when she was in her 30s.
Exactly. So more than 10 years later, she wrote this beautiful copy, and we don't really know anything about, Jane Austen is not going to be necessarily a stenographer or a typist for a rougher version of it. When she's making a fair copy, there's plenty of leeway to do all kinds of changes and improvements. So I think it's very possible there's a lot of the elder Jane Austen in that, because so much of what she sort of did that was great was redone and rewritten. So First Impressions became Pride and Prejudice. Eleanor and Marianne became Sense and Sensibility. So the other things she wrote in that period in the epistolary style, she changed. So I think possibly we're getting a lot of the wisdom. Also, supposedly, this was sort of a project she had with her literary nephew and niece. And they would sort of joke about it, and that some of them were contributing things to it. It was sort of a family project. And so I think that this idea that, and the other thing is the controversy of the title. I'm not sure if many of you have gotten into the whole raging controversy of the title, because to a lot of people, they see Lady Susan on it and they think, well, that's the title. But actually, there's no title on our manuscript. It's titleless. And Susan was the original title of Northanger Abbey. That was later, I think, changed by the publisher. So I don't think she would have called it Lady Susan, since at that time, Susan was something else.
But when she did the fair copy, why didn't she give it a new title?
The thing is, what came down to us possibly was missing what was on the cover. So it was a beautiful, if I had seen the manuscript, I don't think I could have done the adaptation, because what I kidded myself when I was doing the adaptation was that she left this sort of unfinished. It was not really a finished project, and we could make some changes and do all that and not be intimidated by. But actually, she really wrote it very carefully, and it was so beautiful and intimidating.
But you saw the manuscript. Was that after you made the film?
After,
because the manuscript's at the Morgan Library.
Yeah, and I think it's the only surviving manuscript. Yeah. Anyway, those are our pre-movie comments, and we'll have many more secrets afterwards.
Anything that they should
No,
pay
nothing.
Movie,
A lot of secrets afterwards. A lot of scandalous things when we're there. Okay. We'll save some things so people stay. Okay.
Well, I told them you were going to dance at the end.
Yes.
So,
yes. So of course. Okay. Thank you.
Enjoy the movie. When did you first discover Lady Susan?
Well, I first discovered Lady Susan because I'm an idiot, and had hated Northanger Abbey when I was a sophomore in college. And after later getting to love Jane Austen, I realized that I should read it again. And by then...
Well, that's too fast. Why did you hate Northanger Abbey?
well, I read it when I was 18. And Northanger Abbey is it's a parody of Gothic novels. It's a send-up of Gothic novels. And I'd never read a Gothic novel, so I had no idea what the send-up was. And then in my benighted youth, I went to work at Doubleday Publishing House, where Victoria Holt was one of the authors, and so I got to know a lot about Gothic novels. And so when many years later, when I came to buy a copy of Northanger Abbey to give it a go, I liked it very much, having read everything else I knew of by Jane Austen. And behind that, there was some Jane Austen fragments and Lady Susan.
And what did you think?
I thought that maybe I could do a little play in London based on that. Yeah. And I thought it was sort of Oscar Wildean in spirit. And I had met socially a very talented young British play producer, impresario, and told him about it and showed it to him, and he thought it had promise.
And then?
And then he left the business. And I decided that I hated the play format because you couldn't edit. You couldn't cut from one thing to another. And so I started writing it as a screenplay.
And this was quite a long time ago.
Yeah.
That you started writing it as a screenplay.
Yeah.
You had already made other films?
So I started working on it around 2000, 2002, 2003. So the usual 13-year creative process. Trying to hurry things up.
And a while back you had been offered, earlier than that, you'd been offered the opportunity to direct a Jane Austen novel,
yeah.
Sense and Sensibility, but you declined. How come?
Well, I had a theory then. Well, I was between finishing editing in Barcelona and wanting to do Last Days of Disco. And I had a theory then that these novels were masterpieces, and to reduce them to films is like making the classic comic book of something. And I also thought that, like, within that sphere, you didn't need sort of a writer-director. It could be just a very good director with someone else's script. And, I thought that, anyone could turn these into decent movies. Turns out I was wrong, because I think the one I really like is that one, the Ang Lee, Emma Thompson version of Sense and Sensibility. I think that's really great movie. So I got through Last Days of Disco, and I kind of gone through the three things in my life that I could dramatize as a movie that someone might come to. Everything else was just boring life.
You mean Metropolitan,
so
Barcelona,
Metropolitan, Barcelona, and Last Days of Disco seem like sort of interesting moments that might suit doing a film. And then I got into the industry way of being offered something to adapt and all that. And it was always kind of a frustrating experience, because there'd be a lot of people involved. Often it's a book that everyone loves, and you can't change anything, or the part that you like, the producers don't like. And generally it's under copyright, under options, so there's a sort of short period, like by the time the contracts are finished to start writing, there's a little more than a year before the option runs out and they have to buy the book. And so the whole writing process is kind of crazy. And one of the good things about doing public domain material that was kind of obscure was the idea that I could work on it. I had no commission on it, so I was not getting, paid. And I could take my time and put it aside when I got a paying job, and then pick it up again. And that's very sort of positive, because it's so much easier rewriting when you've been away from something for a year or more. A lot of the bad stuff sort of drops out on its own weight of awful. And but then at a certain point, I read that other people were preparing a Lady Susan movie.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so I was kind of desperate.
Who?
Well, it was a company in London, and they had a some writers, and so I went to them and said, well, could we pool our projects together? And they said, no, thank heavens. And then they sort of went out of business or whatever people do in the film business. And I got to work on it, quietly over the next several years.
So that refrain of going out of business, sometimes it's good news, sometimes it's bad news.
If it's the other people, it's good news.
You mentioned coming to Northanger Abbey for the second time after reading virtually everything else you could lay your hands on by Jane Austen. What is it about her work that you loved or that appealed to you so much?
Wow. I think, aren't there a lot of Jane Austen fans here?
Yeah, no, we want your story.
No, but like, who are the Jane Austen fanatics here? Great. Good. Should be more of you, but... I mean, we're really going to talk about why people like Jane. Why I like Jane.
No, why
Austen?
you do? What drew you to her?
Because she's the greatest.
Well, maybe what connection did you feel to Jane Austen's world?
Total. No, really, it's really extraordinary because there's sort of not a sentence in Jane Austen that I don't kind of agree with and identify with and love. And I can't say that about anyone else because I've had other, passions of writers and things like that. But I just adore her point of view, her morality, her taste, her humor and creativity, her stories, her point of view towards everything. But I don't like the juvenilia, I have to say. So I thought it was okay taking the title from the ridiculous juvenile story, Love and Friendship, to recycle. Because I also thought that as she progressed, she really kept coming back to these kind of sententious, important titles with nouns. And, I felt that she used that kind of title on something that was disposable. The story she wrote when she was 14 or 15 under the title Love and Friendship.
Love and Friendship, yeah.
But I see that Penguin was one of the sponsors, and they're tricky people. And they really, I've got my problems with Penguin because they found out what we were doing, and they came out with an edition. They put the short story Love and Friendship with Lady Susan and published an edition called Love and Friendship, which is no end of problems for our poor book.
Your book, yeah.
I went to one book signing, and the book they brought was the Penguin edition. It's frustrating, and it was a Jane Austen Society meeting.
So you had a problem pretending you were her.
So in the future, I have no problem pretending to be her. But I wanted to sell my book because I got a royalty. But in the future, I'm not going to repurpose a public domain title that Penguin can rip off. So there'll be an original title to the next film.
In terms of adapting Lady Susan, I would imagine one of the first challenges is turning letters into drama.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been done elsewhere. I mean, most famously with Les Liaisons Dangereuses. But where did you start?
Well, it's a little bit like shuffling a deck of cards. So you have one letter, and then a letter replying, and a letter replying, and a letter replying. And so it's like taking material from those letters and shuffling them together, like when you cut a pack. And that's sort of the way it proceeded for a lot of time, and shuffled the deck.
And you had to add some characters. For instance, Mrs. Cross, who packs and unpacks.
Well, there's certain sort of structural things. So to get the conversation she would have with Alicia, in the letters Alicia,
Mrs. Johnson. Yeah.
Mrs. Johnson, it had to be someone present. And I think the sort of connection with the servant could have been a good thing, sort of, for her.
Well, it was a very clever thing because it also enabled you. Well, first of all, you pack off Mrs. Cross after she finishes packing and unpacking.
And they're too good friends to pay her.
That's what you get. You manage to get some very good lines where she says, "Oh, I didn't want to burden our friendship by offering to pay her," and of course, then her brother-in-law says, "Yes, you really value friendship.
Value friendship highly."
You value friendship highly." These are all your additions, but they work very well with. But why at that point did you pack off Mrs. Cross? Didn't need her anymore because Mrs. Johnson was coming back on the scene, or
because I wanted to have those lines. Actually, I had a very a sort of very fancy, sort of charming relative of my parents, and he came to visit us. And my mother had sort of modern abstract art by her friends, and so he was looking at the art, and he said, "And who did this?" And she's Jane Smith. She's a very good friend. He said, "You value friendship highly." As he looked. So I knew that line worked.
Yes. And you also added the little minister, the rector.
Yes.
Now, there you get about the Ten Commandments. And also you could use him in the dancing. I know you did this because you cast a little guy so that when he dances with the brother-in-law, it has a lot of comic value. But why else did you add the priest, the minister?
Because I wanted to get my little sermon in about aesthetics. Actually, we were having a really hard time financing the film, as one always does. And I have a film project that's sort of set in Jamaica that's sort of religious. And someone said, well, they're Christian investors, we know. They want to make good films, but with a sort of Christian message, and they might be interested in your Jamaican film. And I said, well, I'm not making the Jamaican film, I'm making the Jane Austen film.
But the Jamaican film, just to clarify, had a musical component and was about, as I understand, Christian singing, the sort of song
all
tradition.
kinds of, yeah, all kinds of. But it's mostly Jamaican music. But a lot of the Jamaican music comes out of the sort of church singing and gospel. I mean, a lot of soul comes out of gospel. So, so I was trying to convince. They said, well, this is not really a Christian mission film, Jane Austen. And there's a lot of non-Christian elements in the film, as you probably noticed. And so I was trying to make it as Christian as possible, and I thought I could also get my sermon into the movie. And they invested in Silence by Scorsese.
Right. And so then, I don't know if we want to digress onto where you got the funding. Did shooting in Ireland help?
Very much so. That is really great. The Irish Film Board is fantastic. We had a wonderful Irish producer, Katie Holly. And the Irish Film Board was sort of co-producer of the film in certain ways, because I had my daughter going to university in Dublin. She trained to be a lawyer there, and so when I'd go to Europe, I'd try to stop in Dublin. And the Irish Film Board knew I wanted to do this Jane Austen film, and the very clever fellow there said, "Oh, you're coming in to the airport. Let me have a locations man meet you there, and he'll show you a few things, and then deposit you into Dublin." So I got free transportation into Dublin, and I got to see the look. And I mean, they were so clever. That happened twice. And almost every location in the movie is something they showed me in those 2 trips from the airport to Dublin to save money and not have to pay cab fare. They were really brilliant.
And stately homes in Ireland can work certainly as well as stately homes, which would be much more
better,
expensive.
Actually,
more expensive in England.
Because I mean, you do want authenticity in a film, and when everything can be authentic, I really want the authentic. But talking to people in London when we were debating between filming around Dublin, filming around London, everyone in London thought it was a better idea, Dublin, really. Because one thing I've noticed about sort of architectural preservation is if some area was really wealthy in a period and then not wealthy afterwards, then the beautiful period is preserved. And so, I mean, there was a terrible moment in Ireland when money started arriving in the 60s, and they started knocking down Georgian Dublin and Georgian Ireland. Fortunately, there is the Georgian Society of Ireland that went to bat to defend the Georgian architecture. and they saved just lots of it. A lot of it was destroyed, but they saved lots and lots of it. And so you really have the wealthy Georgian houses and architecture really close to London. Really close to Dublin. Well, in London, everything takes so long to get. It's a little bit like Los Angeles. It's so spread out, and traffic, and also with all the BBC projects, all those wonderful locations have become incredibly expensive. While still in Ireland, they're reasonable. And they make tons of these kind of films in Ireland.
You would have had to fight Downton Abbey.
What?
You might have had to fight Downton Abbey during that period.
I don't like the it's a wonderful series, but I don't particularly like the architecture. That's 19th century.
in the last days of disco, Kate Beckinsale plays an American, but here you changed the Close 70 character, Mrs. Johnson, into an American. How come? Was it because of the accents?
Well, there are two things. One is I've been through the fight about accents a lot. Even if people are doing a perfect job with the accent, everyone knows they're not English, so they're going to be whining about it, or wherever. And I do think that, a lot of English actors can do a technically very good American accent, but somehow about their performance becomes stiff or different. And so I wasn't very keen on going through the whole, because I had this problem with Damsels in Distress. We have a character in Damsels in Distress who has an English accent that's not perfect, but then at the end we have a scene explaining it, that she went to London for the summer and came back with an English accent, pretended to be English, which a lot of people do, frankly. Yeah. And even though it's explained in the movie why her accent's that way, I got so much grief about it. And people really don't pay close attention when they're watching a film. They just hear the accents. But the thing that really got it for me is that I'd been immersed. So I've been reading tons of Jane Austen, but I was immersed in the sort of biography and history of the period around our War of Independence, which is the same period as this. So that I can read this. I'd really enjoy reading this, but it's also the period of the Lady Susan story. And then I know that the sort of joke of the attitude between the British and Americans, both sides laugh at that. So British saying nasty things about us, it's funny to them because they think it's very true. And it's funny to us because we're used to it. And I'd seen that in Barcelona, that sort of conflict between Europe and America can play as comedy equally well from both sides. And I just had a lot of material about Connecticut and stuff like that. Connecticut is a great punchline.
I understand. It was amazing.
I got to show
I had no idea it would be so funny to say, I understand that the North Sea is cold this time of year.
The North Atlantic.
North Atlantic. No, because in the novel, or in the novella, she is threatened, but she's threatened with rustification. She's threatened to have to leave London and live in the English countryside.
But this raises the stakes.
But this raises the stakes enormously. She's going to get scalped. She's going to freeze on the crossing.
And my family comes from a town right next to Hartford, so they're roots. And Chloe's from Connecticut. And it was great getting to show the film at the Hartford Athenaeum. That was a very good screening.
Now, in her other books, Jane Austen did write about some not very nice characters, usually not the main ones, but they're callous or cruel or manipulative people. But as Margaret Drabble writes in her introduction to the Penguin edition, never again so directly did she attempt to portray vice. Why do you think? Now I know you're disputing when.
That's a great piece she wrote, the Margaret Drabble.
Yeah,
I love that.
It is very good.
I love that.
But do you think it was because Austen was so young when she did the first draft that she could be so heartless, or why do you think that there were more of an 18th century sensibility? Why do you think there is that very hard edge to it?
I think when you are young, I think it is appealing, a certain kind of stylized, satirical version of things. You don't really have the experience of everything. And it's a sort of a way of writing initially. I think a lot of people at very youth are attracted to that kind of writing. I also think there were sort of changes in morals and mores as time went on. There is the 18th century feeling, and I think there's a lot of sort of Austen family biography there, where so Lady Susan is, let me see, Catherine Vernon is protecting her brother from this woman, and that Jane Austen had a cousin who was sort of Frenchified, Eliza de Foyade,
whose husband was
guillotined. And she was a bit of a scandalous character. She's a bit of a lady. I mean, I think she was a good person, but she's a little bit of a Lady Susan type. And she was bewitching Jane Austen's beloved brother, her favorite brother.
And married him.
Yeah. And so there was sort of a dangerous liaisons thing happening in the family at that time. And she would come and they'd do the theatricals that later were pilloried in Mansfield Park. So there's a lot of feeling in there. But it also, over the decades, manners changed and morals changed, and you're heading towards the Victorian era, and the end of the 18th century had one point of view, and as it went into the 19th century, it became more moralistic and more proper. Sort of like the production code arriving. Or
you
something.
think? I mean, we're still in the Georgian period, I think, when she's writing these.
Georgian period is sort of endless. It's good to get into specifics, Regency. This pre-Regency.
You decided to soften that hard edge that is in the novella.
You think?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just having these wonderful actresses inhabit the role. So you have somebody like Kate Beckinsale, who's just so full of charm and wit, and I mean, she could be a diplomat. I mean, her rhetoric, her capacity for rhetoric, and her confidence. The confidence is in the novella as well, but the way that you present her, I think you do soften her a little bit. You don't. No.
I guess so. I remember it being rejected by people. Like the first person I showed it to was a British distributor who I knew through friends, and she just hated it and said, "These women are just horrible bitches. I can't possibly do it." She ended up being the British distributor.
Alongside your writing the screenplay and directing the film, you also wrote a novel called Love and Friendship, subtitled, in which Jane Austen's Lady Susan Vernon is entirely vindicated. And it's narrated by a character that you conjured up, Sir James Martin's nephew. What did you want to do there?
Well, I don't really like just doing a novel that's the same thing as the movie. So this is the second time I've done a novel after doing a movie. So the first was Last Days of Disco with Cocktails at Petrosian afterwards. And in that case, the narrator is one of the actual people from the story, the characters in the film portray.
The ad man.
Yeah,
Jimmy.
And so he could narrate that. And in this case, in the course of making the film, this character, Sir James Martin, became very big because the actor Tom Bennett is so funny. And as my research on Jane Austen, I was reading her kind of pretentious nephew's memoir of my aunt Jane Austen in the later period. And so this character is born as sort of a hybrid between the Sir James Martin portrayed by Tom Bennett, which is an idiot, and the pretentious nephew defending an aunt. And so in this case, he defends everything that Lady Susan Vernon does that you think might be negative or bad in some way. He has the positive version. And having had a stepmother, I know how this works. And so, no, there are many good stepmothers. There are many good stepmothers.
Tell me more about this one.
What?
I said, tell me more about this one.
No, I think she's still alive, actually, so maybe I shouldn't.
I'm kidding you, but...
The good die young.
You bring that in too about, except that actually does come. There's a blur when you read the two side by side. Between your wit and the original, there's a bit of a blur in some.
I
of the
should say
quoting.
that our edition includes both Rufus. His name again, Colonna Martin
or something. He's got 4 barrels.
Rufus Martin
and,
Colonna's version, defense of his aunt, and also the spinster authoress's negative portrayal. It's included too, the original.
Yeah, the spinster authoress.
You know it as the Jane Austen original.
Well, but none of her novels were published under her real name during her lifetime, so it's quite appropriate within the framework of that
and
book.
she called herself an authoress.
and then he just added spinster just to make it even nicer,
Yes. More precise.
more precise. So there are elements of your screenplay in this book, and there's this whole
A lot
other,
of new stuff.
A lot of new
And there's
stuff,
some
yeah.
theology. There's more theology. The
you
stride
have-
of faith. The
There's a-
stride
sorry?
of, well, there's a leap of faith, but a leap of faith sounds scary. So he has the stride of faith.
There's also a whole. I love there's a wonderful footnote about when his eyes were open.
Yes.
Somebody opened his eyes to something.
Yes.
And then he realized how risky it was to have your eyes open because no bad things happen to you when
Almost
your eyes are
nothing
closed.
bad happens when your eyes are closed. Very rare that something bad happens.
Jane Austen left Lady Susan relatively unpunished at the end of her novella. She marries Sir James Martin. So she's
No, I think she's punished.
well, she's
that's
punished to
punishment.
marry him. No, but she's,
No,
at least
in the
she's-
movie she's unpunished.
Yeah, no. Just but in the novella, she's relatively unpunished in the sense that she marries him, so she's financially secure. I know she's punished in the sense that who would want to marry the blockhead, but it makes her financially secure. You reward her a lot more.
Yes.
How come?
A happy ending.
And you also hasten the wedding between Frederica and Reginald because in the novella again it's left a little ambiguous.
Yeah.
He's so wounded it's going to take him a year to recover or even think about marrying again. So is that just to have the Austinian double marriage or wedding ending as a la
Yes.
Pride and Prejudice and so
Yes,
on?
correct.
Yes. You were intermittently reading Pride and Prejudice while you were working on your first film, Metropolitan, as you said, to cleanse the palate. But
One thing about all this idea that there have been so many adaptations of Jane Austen, I don't think there were almost any before Metropolitan. So there was the Pride and Prejudice with Greer Garson back when in the 1940s.
Yep.
And maybe there had been some BBC adaptations that didn't make much of an impact. But when we talked a lot about Mansfield Park in Metropolitan, it wasn't as if there was a big Jane Austen. I think that Merchant Ivory had an odd thing called Jane Austen in Manhattan, but I'm not sure exactly what that was. But it was really one of their, I think, their most obscure film. So this idea that there are just so many adaptations, it really was this kind of craze from 95 to 2002 or something like that. In the summer, 95 had Clueless and Sense and Sensibility and Persuasion. And
I
then
think maybe the TV Pride and Prejudice a few years earlier was also huge.
no, that was after that was right around then.
It was around the same time.
They're all mid-90s,
They're all mid-90s,
or late
right.
late 90s.
Right. With that's when we had Colin Firth.
I'm sort of glad because I was so wrong about, that, any people can do them, they'll turn out well. So it is sort of, I think a lot of them could be successfully remade or made anew.
You've said that when it comes to seeing adaptations, never read the book first.
Yes, don't
Why?
read them.
Why?
'Cause what's the point? It's crazy. See the movie and later, if you love it, read the book, but it's just going to spoil the plot points and things like that. And it really, I was, with a film critic, and I said, why cram the book, reading the book right before you see the movie? And say, well, the editors want us to be able to tell the people who are fans of the book if the movie does justice to the book. But like the fans of the book might have read it 5 years before, and it's like a vague memory. But the critic who's reading it, it's just like, it's painful, the idea they're just going to read it and then see the movie like immediately after. Like no one normal does that. Why not see the movie and then if your editor makes you read the book and then you can judge? But I must admit, some of the films I really like were novels that I detested.
Like what?
Well, I don't think I can say because I loved Howard's End movie, and I detested the novel.
Oh.
But when I read Howard's End, the novel, I knew it was my mother's favorite novel, so I was going to hate it.
Oh, we're back with that now. But to me, one of the problems with seeing the movie first is that when you read the novel, you keep seeing the actors while you're trying to
Oh, I see.
read the characters, and then the actors are very vivid.
I don't mind if you see Kate Beckinsale and
No. I'm not saying it applies here necessarily, but just in general when that happens. But I'm getting the sign we're supposed to go to questions. So please wait till the microphone comes to you if you have a question.
And if there are no questions, we can just keep talking. People have to get their ferry ride, don't they? They have to get a train or... You've got ferries here, don't you? Okay, everyone, some people have to leave for the ferry.
Do we have any questions? Well, no.
I'm sure there's a question out there.
I'm going to give you another question while they're thinking about it. The idea of the group.
There's one.
Yeah, I know, but I started.
Okay, too late.
No, wait.
You lose.
Hold that thought. The idea of the group, it's coming together to talk and connect and change. I mean, it features not only in Metropolitan, but in one way or another, all your other films. It's not exactly Austen's, 3 or 4 families in a village that she described as all you need for a novel. But do you see a connection? Do you see an influence on your own work from Austen's?
I guess so. I suppose so.
You just want to have her question.
No, the thing is, there's certain things in the film business, the way it's structured, that sort of force a lot of stories into the same sort of straitjackets. So in film, you really have to have a star part because you have to sell a film with a star. And for that, you have to star part. So you can't really have an ensemble film or an ensemble. The structure of the film industry goes against ensemble stories. But as a writer, an ensemble story is really interesting and really great. And I guess the reason why I'm writing is because I like the idea of recreating social texture. Because I remember coming out of university and feeling like there's no social texture in our lives in North America. There are no kind of groups of friends doing these things. And I sort of fantasized groups of friends and parties and dancing and all this kind of stuff. Just trying to recreate something that you're not sure if it really exists.
And the first question is over there.
Oh, hi. Well, I would like to know which one of the Jane Austen novel is your favorite and which movie adaptation you like the most. Thank you.
I have 3 favorites, which are Persuasion, Mansfield Park, and Pride and Prejudice. I really adore those. Emma is also magnificent, but something about the Emma character is off-putting, and it ends up being great, but it's a little painful getting there. And Sense and Sensibility I like a lot too. Northern Abbey I'm still not entirely convinced about. Was there something else? Did I miss something?
Which movie adaptation do you like the best?
Well, I like Sense and Sensibility, the movie, the best. I really love that. I think it's great. They just beautiful job.
Ang Lee and Emma Thompson's screenplay.
And I think it's very good, the TV version of Pride and Prejudice. That was very good. People tell me that there's been a recent series of Sense and Sensibility that's also good, but I haven't seen that. I plan to...
Okay, don't know.
Since I'm getting to the end of Downton, I plan to look at that.
Since you're getting to the end of...
End of Downton.
End of Downton. Up there somewhere. Yes, over there.
Hi. So, that's loud. So one of the appeals of Jane Austen, I find, is this nature or this characterization of these women and the power they wield, despite at that time there were a lot of elements of their lives that weren't not powerful. So it's like a secret power that they wield with the people around them. In recent years, there's been an adaptation of her narratives. Clueless is an example of one. I'm also thinking of others that sort of try to take that power to another level, and they're very irreverent, like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies and Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters. I was wondering if you were familiar with any of those and what your thoughts are on that direction.
Yeah, I really like the Jane Austen stories set in Jane Austen's period. And I'm reverent. I don't like irreverent. And so I was quite frustrated where the cool opinion in 1995 was, oh, Clueless is the good Jane Austen film. I really hated that because it's a fine teen comedy. Okay, good. I don't think the nature of Jane Austen is her plots. I don't think plots are particularly important. And since I think that the people working on Sense and Sensibility did an absolutely magnificent, beautiful job, that deserves some admiration, and not Clueless particularly. I mean, Clueless is a fine, popular film. And so now Pride and Prejudice and Zombies was directed by a fellow you'll see tomorrow night if you come. Burr Steers plays the door Nazi at the disco, the people who keeps everyone out of the club. And he told me later he took the part just to see how indie films are made. And he made a indie film called Igby Goes Down that did very well with one of the Culkin brothers. And then he's become a very successful director, and he did Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. And interestingly, he cast 3 of our actresses in that, but we had already cast them. So one of the sort of good things about not being financed is you can have like this endless casting. So Morfydd Clark, who does a wonderful job as Frederica in this, we were the first to cast her in a film. Unfortunately, we made the film after 2 other films she had made. But having a super long casting period is really helpful because, you know, different people become available at different times. You get to see them finally. But I mean, it's a good point, and a lot of people disagree with me, and like the use of Jane Austen in other contexts.
I was wanting to go back to your comment about how you agreed with everything that she writes and her ideas, her attitudes, etc. And I'm wondering about her, whether or not she's a Tory, and whether or not you're a Tory.
Well, one of the things I like about reading late 18th century history and biography and that is that, like, if you do political conflicts, you read about political controversies now, it's really emotional. You're on one side or another side. And I sort of love the debates back then because I can see their point and I can see their point, and it's kind of irrelevant to me. And so I am much more Whig Protestant, and she's much more Tory High Church, but I don't think she really puts that in the novels. So one of the things about her juvenilia, it's not the reason I don't like her juvenilia, but she's just a passionate Tory bigot in her juvenilia. I mean, vicious stuff against us Protestants. And so I think in her novels that doesn't arise exactly. But that's a good point.
Oh, is it me already? Oh, sorry. This will maybe show my ignorance, but I'm just so interested in your answer.
Ignorance is my favorite thing.
Okay. Sort of speaking to the relationship between the US and England at
Yes.
the time. So I'm looking at Chloe Sevigny, and to me, she's ultimately American in this movie. You know,
Yes.
she's kind of large built. Her manner, her expression, everything is very, it feels like it's kind of unaffected, right? So she's not sort of obeying all the rules of behavior. But I just wondered, can you help me understand what then is the timing here that someone would be so American already? It's just near the time of the War of Independence.
Yes.
What
Well,
was the timeline that people had a chance to become that American already?
Well, you should read the novel based on the movie,
okay.
and all these things will be answered.
Okay. I'm sorry for an ignorant question.
So you had families that would have left in the 17th century, but some of them maintained a lot of contacts and commercial contacts with the mother country. And so we make her Alicia Delancey. She's the Connecticut branch of the Delancey family. And the New York branch of the Delancey family, which was the existing branch, they went back to England and they went to Oxford and they read law in the Inns of Court or whatever it was. And then they came back to be, lieutenant governor of New York and things like that. And so you had, over 100 years of separation of growing up in a different continent, but you still had the link. And so one of the things that happened after our War of Independence is the losing side, the Tories, the very well-connected went to London, and then many came to Halifax and everywhere else, and others went to the Caribbean. And so this is all very historical. In fact, the poem in the wedding scene is from a poem that was recited in the wedding of General Knox, who is our commander of artillery. He married the daughter of a Tory family, a wealthy Tory family, and that was his best man's toast in the wedding. And her family, when Boston fell, immediately had to leave, and they came to Halifax. And so that's sort of part of the background.
One last question.
Okay. Thank you very much. I really enjoy all your films. I've seen
Thanks.
all of them. And I love Chloe Sevigny and Kate Beckinsale, who you obviously love too.
Yeah.
I wonder if you'd ever thought about taking that sort of character group or that situation of Metropolitan, Last Days of Disco, and doing something with those people in the current day or something like that. And if not that, what are you working on?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so many projects would be interesting to do, and then actually realizing them is so difficult. So I do have a series proposal to continue something I did a few years ago called The Cosmopolitans, that we did a pilot, and I've been writing those scripts. And so Chloe was in that, and I hope to have her continuing. So that was Adam Brody, who is in from Damsels in Distress, who I really like, and Chloe's in that, and some new actors. And I hope to get Tom Bennett and who plays Sir James Martin in this, and also Justin Edwards, who plays Charles Vernon, the very complacent, the very congenial,
Very agreeable,
the very agreeable, very agreeable husband. And I'm watching Downton Abbey because I'd love to get Maggie Smith into it. So I hope that will go forward. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It was a really fun evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.